better connection. And about 20 seconds, I think we'll be live on YouTube. Almost there. The wheel is spinning. All right, we are live on Zoom and live on YouTube. Good to go. Welcome. Hello. My name is Susan Gunn. I'm the director of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns. My colleague, Dan Moriarty, and I are coming to you today from our homes in Washington, D.C. We're working from home during the pandemic for the Office for Global Concerns, and we continue to represent the three branches of the Maryknoll mission, and that is the Maryknoll Sisters, the Fathers and Brothers, and the Lay Missioners. And we work closely with the Maryknoll affiliates. Our job is to bring the Maryknoll mission experience to important debates about public policy at the UN, on Capitol Hill, to the World Bank, IMF, and the corporate world. And our mission always is to promote peace, social justice, and the integrity of creation. And we do this through education, advocacy, and action. Today, we want to offer some education, and this time about peace building and national security. I'm so excited to have Dan present today because he is the leading thinker on peace building for Maryknoll. Dan's work with the Maryknoll Office in Washington as our Sustainable Pathways to Peace coordinator makes him the right person to strengthen the voice of the Catholic community in the debate over national security policy and the best practices for peace building. So while Dan talks to us, I want to invite everyone to type questions for him. If you're on Zoom, you do that through the Q&A. If you're watching on YouTube, you can use the chat box there. So with that, I turn it over to you, Dan.
Thanks very much. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is share my screen, so give me just a second to do that. Okay, today I'm here to talk about rethinking security in this time of pandemic. No justice, no peace. Now I know that phrase, no justice, no peace, can be intimidating. To some people it sounds like a threat, but I hope by the end of this presentation and in the light of some of our own Catholic tradition, we might be able to rethink how we hear those words and what they mean to us. Like all the webinars in this series, this one is based on a 2-page written brief, which you can find at our website, maryknollogc.org, and there's also a whole page of great resources for further reading on this and all the topics in the series. You'll notice each of the briefs follows the popular methodology used in the church throughout the world: see, judge, and act. See, getting to understand an issue. Judge means deciding where we stand on that issue based on our faith, and that allows us to act on what we've learned as people of faith and engaged citizens. Now, our title is Rethinking Security, and when we talk about elections and U.S. policy, we're especially talking about the concept of national security. The COVID-19 pandemic has really forced us to take a hard look at both words in that phrase, national security, because the pandemic is not just national, it's global. It highlights our global interconnectedness. If one country on the other side of the world is unable to contain the virus, we're at greater risk here at home too. So we need to think beyond national security. But when we think of security, we often think of one thing above all others: military defense. And the most powerful military in the history of the world has done nothing to make us more secure in the face of this virus. Our national security regime is inadequate in addressing this grave threat to our security. The same thing's true of a number of the main security threats facing the U.S. today. The fires in the West and the hurricanes in the East remind us how badly climate change threatens our security. People who have lost their homes in those disasters join hundreds of millions of migrants and refugees on the move around the globe. Our economy is inextricably tied to the global economy, which has been devastated by the pandemic. The production and distribution of food is also globalized, and as food banks in our community struggle to keep up, 250 million people right now are in immediate danger of going hungry around the world. We know that violent conflict happens around the world where there is exclusion of different ethnic and racial groups, and now we see racial tensions and racial violence in our own country leading to civil unrest. These are all dire threats to our security, but we cannot defend against them through military means, and we cannot defend against them without addressing them around the world. Our traditional national security model fails to address the diversity of threats and the global nature of security in the 21st century. When we debate the federal budget, the Pentagon or the Department of Homeland Security often get first dibs because we think of them as national security, but they take their portion of the pie from other areas we know are actually vital to true security, like diplomacy or economic development abroad or environmental protections and public health here at home. One major problem with a national security model that emphasizes defense and preparedness for war is that it leads to what experts call the security dilemma. When a country pursues its own national security by building up arms and military capacity, that makes other countries feel less secure, leading them to do the same, which leads to arm races, costs more money, raising tensions, and ultimately decreasing security. It's a vicious cycle. An example, earlier this week, Israel and the United Arab Emirates normalized relations. It's being touted as a peace accord, but it's really more of a trade agreement because it allows the UAE to buy F-35 fighter jets and other arms they want from the US. That makes the Israelis nervous because they like to be sure they're the dominant military power in the region. So even as the signing was happening here in Washington Tuesday, high-level Israeli officials wondered out loud if it'll last and said that if the Emirates buy the arms they're seeking, then the Israelis will buy even more arms to offset that. It's hard to see how this makes the Middle East more secure, but investors in U.S. arms manufacturers can probably sleep better at night. For several years, the United Nations has been promoting an alternative to national security based on preparing for war. And instead of national security, they urge countries to seek what they call human security. Quakers and Catholics and others have called this different names, but essentially it's a security approach that does two things. It recognizes the need for international cooperation to address the global nature of threats to human security, and it recognizes that we become more secure when we invest in all aspects of building peace, using nonviolent, non-military tools to address security issues from healthcare to climate change to racial justice. One major global initiative for pursuing human security is through the Sustainable Development Goals. By 2030, the UN hopes to achieve goals in 17 different areas of sustainable development: economic development and alleviating poverty and peace and conflict, but also everything from healthcare to access to water to democracy building and inclusion, promoting women, and tackling the climate crisis. Again, we tend to think of development and so many of these issues as different from security or peace building, but UN Secretary of General Antonio Guterres sees them as part and parcel to another major UN initiative, which is the Sustaining Peace Agenda. The development goals, as ambitious and wide-ranging as they are, actually exist within this greater agenda. In his 2018 report outlining the Sustaining Peace Agenda, Guterres directly links development to peace, calling it, quote, the best defense against the risks of violent conflict, end quote. The agenda puts the onus back on national and local governments to contribute to peace in all these different ways in their own communities. International affairs and foreign assistance are still important, but instead of helping other countries build up their own military defenses, our aid must seek to build up the capacities of other governments to meet all of these diverse needs of their own people. Now, it sounds like I'm really painting an idyllic picture of the United Nations, and we know the UN hasn't always been the most effective tool for stopping wars and making the world a peaceful place, but it's important to understand that the UN kind of works in two different ways, which are sometimes at odds with one another. On the one hand, there's the UN's own institutional identity, the Secretary General and all the agencies that do the work of promoting the development goals, advancing the vision of the Sustaining Peace Agenda, etc. This is where we see an emphasis on the global, holistic concept of human security. But the UN is also a body made up of each of its individual member states. And most of these member states, particularly the powerful ones like the US, continue to operate out of a military defense-based national security model. We can see this in the way we spend money, but we can also see how much more efficient a human security approach is than a national security approach. The Pentagon budget is really kind of a money pit. The more we spend on the military, the more other countries spend, the more advanced and expensive our weapon systems become, etc. And while we may deter some wars for some time, we don't generally see an increase in peace and security, and the costs just go up and up. This year, depending on which costs you count, the defense and military budget is between $746 billion and $1.25 trillion. The Trump administration is basically seeking to keep that the same in 2021. Compare that to all non-military international affairs like diplomacy and aid. Those come to just $55.8 billion. And yet President Trump would cut that by 22%. Even during this global pandemic, he's asking to cut global health spending by 34% in 2021. Meanwhile, even in the recent COVID relief package put forth by the Senate, there's $29.4 billion in additional funds for the military. Some of that's for costs directly related to the virus, but it also includes $8 billion just to be spent on more weapons that cannot kill the coronavirus. Even at the UN, where military spending is relatively minuscule, the UN spends $7 billion a year on peacekeeping operations, like the work of Blue Helmet troops. But all the work the Secretariat does in conflict prevention, mediation, and peace building, they spend fewer than $1 billion on all that. Nonviolent, holistic approaches to human security cost less, and they also build peace and reduce violence, so we don't need to spend as much on military-based security and preparing for war. Where armed defense is a money pit, it turns out sustainable peace through development is a great investment. It's cheaper, more cost-effective, and achieves more of the security we really need. Last year, the U.S. did pass one really momentous piece of legislation that employs a human security approach, the Global Fragility Act. It seeks to prevent violent conflict by addressing root causes like inequality and extremism. Consider the hundreds of billions of dollars spent on addressing violent conflict when we fail to prevent them. And look at this, the Global Fragility Act budget is just $230 million. Even if it's eventually expanded, prevention like this will always prove less expensive than defense, both in lives and treasure. Another amazing nonviolent tool for decreasing violence and building peace is what's called unarmed civilian protection. This is really something amazing to behold. Unarmed groups, often led by women, who go into war zones and accompany likely victims of violence. It may sound naive, but they've proven astoundingly effective and lead to more long-lasting steps toward peace. Please check out the resource page on our website and read about one of the groups doing this work called Nonviolent Peace Force. They are advocating right now for federal money to be invested in this heroic, effective work for peace. How much are they asking for? Just $25 million. Now, how do we know that these are such smart investments? Well, we didn't always. I remember as a teenager, I once heard Audrey Hepburn interviewed, and she noted that we have a whole science and centuries of studies about how to most effectively wage war, and how strange it is we haven't studied peace the same way. She mentioned peace studies, and it planted a seed in me that I carried and watered through my years as a Maryknoll lay missioner in Bolivia until it finally led me to do graduate work in peace studies. So it turns out there is such a science. Thanks to the work of peace scholars, we know what leads to peace. We know that societies are more resilient to crises, be they natural disaster, violent conflict, or pandemics, the freer, more equal, inclusive, and democratic they are. We know that addressing the root causes of violence, signs of fragility from poverty to extremism, is indeed effective in preventing violence and atrocity. We know that there are proven nonviolent tools for decreasing violence. We know diplomacy works best when it's multilateral. We know that unarmed civilian protection actually works. We know how crucial it is to the success of any peace process that it include youth, and we know that peace-building efforts led by women are more durable. Emerging scholarship, and you can find links to this on our page, demonstrates that social movements are more successful in the short term and lead to more significant lasting changes in the long term when they're nonviolent than when they employ violence. If you'd like to read in much more depth about how we know all this, one great place to start is at the Institute for Economics and Peace. They recently published their latest Global Peace Index, which delves into a lot of this research. And they also do a report on positive peace, which is similar to the concept of human security in that it envisions peace not simply as the absence of war, in other words, negative peace, but as the presence of myriad conditions that sustain peace. So what have we learned about national security? First, we need to move from our traditional military defense-based national security model toward a global, holistic, human security model. This means addressing all the different concerns that contribute to sustainable development. Because sustainable development reduces violence, builds peaceful relationships between people, and makes that peace sustainable. Fortunately, this kind of security is attained through nonviolent means that are far more economical than military defense. These nonviolent tools effectively prevent and decrease violence. They also address all the different kinds of threats to our security, not just armed conflict, but global pandemics, fires and storms from climate change, and civil unrest born from racism. This makes our communities and the world more peaceful. That in turn decreases the need for expensive military programs. This saves us even more money, which can then be reinvested in even more just peace. Instead of a vicious cycle of spending and war, we seek a virtuous circle of development and peace. One great and really relevant example of how we can promote global human security is Maryknoll lay missioner Larry Parr in El Salvador. We've all heard some policymakers warn of the national security threat posed by violent Central American migrants, but instead of building walls and cages, Larry addresses the problem with soccer balls, pencils, and books. He says that with the educational opportunities he helps provide, quote, young people facing a reality full of gangs and military and police violence can become leaders to transform their communities into an environment of peace and prosperity. Larry's faithful witness offers a nice segue to the judge portion of our analysis. How does our Catholic tradition help us to understand this issue? How does our faith call us to pursue security? Fortunately, we have a rich tradition, one that goes back to the nonviolence of Jesus and the vision of the prophets, but also in church teaching that speaks to the complexities of our own modern, globalized, nuclear-armed reality. Since Pope John XXIII issued his encyclical Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, in 1963, every pope has made prophetic, visionary contributions to our understanding of how we, as Christians, must understand these issues. We've heard a lot in recent years about Pope Francis's vision of integration, tying care for the environment to issues of poverty and social justice and war and peace. But he's building on a long tradition. It was Pope Paul VI in the 1960s who famously reflected on the words of the prophet Isaiah, "Justice will bring about peace, right will produce calm and security." Isaiah understood that we will not achieve peace and security through weapons and war, but through good works and the pursuit of social justice. So the Pope turned that insight into clear instruction. If you want peace, work for justice. Paul VI was truly a visionary on this issue. He saw clearly that investing in poverty reduction and integral human development through global cooperation was actually a lower cost, higher yield investment in peace and security than was military spending. So in 1967, over 50 years before Secretary General Guterres described sustainable development goals as the way to reduce violence and build peace, Paul VI called development the new name for peace. At the same time, he called for the establishment of what we called a World Fund, by which every country would take a portion of its military budget and place it in a fund to support the economic development of impoverished countries in ways determined by those countries. Is it not plain to everyone, he asked, that such a fund would reduce the need for those other expenditures that are motivated by fear and stubborn pride? Paul VI sought an integral development aimed at the common good. Drawing from the Catholic value of subsidiarity, he sought decolonization by insisting that wealthy countries not dictate how the funds would be used. His vision is really remarkable. Today, Pope Francis has seized mightily on the concept of integration. It's one of his favorite words. It refers to the same interconnectedness the pandemic has highlighted so dramatically, that of people with one another and with creation, and that of all the issues that threaten security, from poverty to the environment to violent conflict. Pope Francis has used the phrase integral ecology to describe an approach to the environment that maintains this connection to peace and economic justice. He's highlighted previous popes' language about integral human development. So in order to maintain this same sense of the inseparability of peace, economic justice, and care for our common home, I think we should think of Catholic peace building in terms of integral security, an approach that builds on the positive peace and human security models. Another helpful context for understanding how all these issues are integrated is what's called the just peace ethic. Eli McCarthy with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative has done a lot of work on this. You can find it on the resource page. He describes a peace approach that seeks to wage conflict nonviolently and constructively, to interrupt cycles of violence where they exist, and to build sustainable peace. And the Church also puts its theory into practice. The Holy See is engaged in creative and effective diplomacy, guided by the Catholic concepts of humanitarian and integral disarmament. And the Vatican's COVID-19 task force has been doing amazing, relevant work helping the Pope develop his thinking on how the pandemic calls us to rethink economics, peace, and security. That brings us right into the final action section. Because the first thing you can do is watch Pope Francis on Monday when he'll address the UN General Assembly. He'll be outlining a new vision for the global economy based on what we've learned from the pandemic. It should be great. Then get involved. Reach out to campaigns and let them know you care about these issues and find out where the candidates stand. I know neither major political party is quite as visionary as the Church or even the United Nations is on thinking about security. They're generally still operating out of a defense-heavy national security mindset. But that doesn't mean you can't vote for candidates whose policies would move us closer to where we want to be. In each part of the election, discern which candidates would advance multilateralism and diplomacy. Ask them to renew the New START nuclear arms reduction treaty in February, to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal, to stay in the Paris Climate Agreement, and to work with the World Health Organization to improve their crucial work during this pandemic. Seek COVID relief that includes foreign assistance and does not increase military spending. Decrease military spending overall and increase funding for nonviolent peace-building programs like the Global Fragility Act and the inclusion of unarmed civilian protection in our foreign operations budget. And finally, we're the Maryknoll Office for global concerns, and generally we focus on international affairs, but as we've discussed, integral security means helping other countries address human needs, but also our own. So check out Network and other Catholic organizations who've put out helpful voter guides on domestic issues, such as climate policy, public education, healthcare equity, and alleviating poverty. So, as I hope we'll all continue to support the movement to end racial injustice and police violence, the next time we hear that chant, no justice, no peace, perhaps we'll hear it a little differently. We must remain always nonviolent. Those words should never be used as a threat, but they do serve as an important warning and an echo of the prophet Isaiah and of Pope Paul VI's charge that if we want peace and integral security, we must work for justice. Now, please, I urge you, make sure you're registered, vote early where you can, and do it. Cast your vote for integral security and just peace. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much, Dan. You raise a lot of compelling points about church teaching and the current state of U.S. policy in regard to peace building and national security. I have a couple of questions that I've collected from our people watching. And I'm going to start off with, what would you say to people who are concerned that shifting some of our focus and resources away from the military might create a vacuum that would put us at a greater risk?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's important to realize this is not a pacifist call to abolish the military. That's another topic, but it's it's really a call to invest in peace. And so the change wouldn't even happen overnight. We saw how much less peace building uh, initiatives cost than military initiatives. So just with things like weapon systems that are in the federal budget that the Pentagon hasn't even asked for, or the $13 billion contract signed this week to renew our ICBM program, which the majority of Americans don't want, and a lot of experts say is no longer necessary. We could fund all of these things. And then once they begin to work, we see the threats of violent conflict decrease. And then maybe we can look at decreasing even further our military spending. So this is really a way of investing in peace and achieving the same things that in many ways the military has failed to achieve. And it also, like I said, addresses other security needs like the like addressing the pandemic or climate change.
Wise investments, right, that grow. Absolutely. Yeah. Another question that's coming in is about the current state in the United States of political polarization. What is the impact of our polarization on efforts to bring peace to other parts of the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it definitely impacts our ability in a couple ways. I think there is a tendency to pursue some more radical kind of agendas in terms of punitive foreign policy and things, and resist any calls from across the aisle to temper that. I think also a lot of legislation is stalled, is not being passed. So that includes some of these kinds of peace building initiatives. But I will say on a hopeful note that some of these things like the Global Fragility Act really do enjoy bipartisan support, even in this time of so much division, because people are on both sides of the aisle are sincerely concerned with security and like to save money. So if they can achieve both, and if you can show them how these things work, I think they really cut through some of that division, which is an exciting possibility.
Well, you mentioned the word hope, and that's my third and final question. I'm noting our time. We have about 1.5 minutes left. So given all the concerns that you mentioned, can you name something concrete that's giving you hope in this moment, particularly during the pandemic?
Yeah, I think one thing that gives me hope is church leadership. And one thing I should say, I showed that slide of church leaders, and they were popes because I was talking about encyclicals. That was a lot of men. But one thing that's really exciting right now is the way that the Vatican has been really proactive about seeking out voices of experts and looking at what to do in the face of this pandemic. Marie Dennis, who works with Pax Christi International and the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, and used to be the director of our office, has been on the COVID task force. And Susan, I know that you've worked with the COVID task force through our membership in CIDSE, the Aid and Development and Human Rights branch of the Catholic Church in Europe. And so we've had a lot of great voices participating in that. And so that's, I would repeat again, watch the Pope's speech on Monday at the United Nations, because he's going to be talking about how we rethink economics and surely peace and other issues in the face of the pandemic, and he's building on a lot of great information. And I will put in the resources also some of the documents that have come out of that task force, because it's really visionary stuff.
Yeah. Thank God for that moment of hope, particularly in leading up to the election and the polarization that we're feeling now, that Pope Francis has welcomed us in dialogue. He's walking the walk that he talks about. Well, looking at the time, that's all we have time for today. I want to say a big thank you to Dan for this excellent presentation, and to everyone for joining us. I hope this webinar, the two-pager on peace building and national security on our website, that all of that empowers us to contribute to important conversations this election year. And I want to invite you to our next webinar on October 1st, 12:30 p.m. Eastern, about the state of food security during the pandemic. So the registration link for that webinar is on our website. So just follow Dan's directions and you can't miss it. So I hope to see you all again on October 1. And until then, peace. Take care.
Peace. Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.